Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host, and today I'm going to provide you with a diplomatic briefing about the forthcoming G20 summit in India uh, around September 7th and 9th. This is going to be an important event, perhaps the most important diplomatic event of the calendar. G20, as you know, is a forum where the world's 20 richest economies and the European Union get together to essentially discuss global financial policies. They set the global agenda, especially in the area of trade and economics. And this forum was created basically after the 2008 global crisis, economic crisis, and essentially to stabilize the global economy. But over a period of time, it has assumed greater importance as it addresses other issues other than just economic and financial issues and trade issues. It also talks about sometimes about environment and climate change, pandemics, obviously, as a result of COVID, which did impact the global economy, but also the issues of how to combat biological challenges. And it's also now talking about debt relief to countries which have suffered significantly as a result of the double punch of COVID, the 1-2 punch of COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, G20 is preoccupied and even obsessed with trying to ensure that Ukraine wins the war against Russia. They're trying their best to do. So in many ways, G20, even though it was created as a forum to stabilize global economy and global trade, now essentially acts as a substitute to the UN plus UN Security Council. So it is unencumbered by the rules and regulations and structures of the UN and the UN Security Council. So this is a free-floating forum where essentially, to a great extent, G7 countries dominate the forum, getting some resistance from Russia and China, but otherwise, G7 get whatever they want in most G20 forums. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about 4 things that I think are important and things to look out for as we go into the India summit. Actually, let's make it 5, and I'll tell you which one I just added. As we go into the summit. So you can look out for these things to see if these things are happening, these 5 things that I'm identifying. Number 1, G20 this year was supposed to set up and highlight the significance of India as a global power, that India has now become a major power in the world. It is the world's 5th biggest economy, bigger than France and Italy and Britain, and is now on the verge of becoming the 3rd biggest economy. It's the biggest importer of weapons. It has the 3rd biggest defense budget, and so on. It's now the buddies with the US and Japan, and so what G20 and SCO, which also happened under India's chairmanship this year, we're expected to do in 2023 is to stamp the fact that India has now arrived as a major world power. So this is the last chance in this year where India gets to play the role of a global leader and set the agenda for the world. That is the important part. G20 was India's opportunity to shape the global dialogue and take it in the direction that it wants to do. It failed with the foreign ministers meeting where there was no consensus. It failed in the finance ministers meeting where there was no consensus, primarily because G7 countries pushed the Ukraine issue, and given the fact that there's Russia and China in it, no matter how hard India tried, it was impossible to get a consensus because of G7 versus China, Russia, and India was caught in the middle. So the thing number 1 that you need to look out is, to what extent is India now at this summit of the heads of states and governments able to influence the agenda and bring out the issues that it wants to discuss. It wants to become the voice of the global south. It held a summit with 120 countries before the whole G20 presidency began, with the explicit goal of bringing these things, the concerns of G20 to concerns of the global south to G20. And so one thing to see is to what extent does India emerge as the voice of the global South, given the fact that in BRICS it was very clear that China was the dominant leader in the global South, which just concluded in Johannesburg, the BRICS annual summit. But India has a chance at G20 to make a comeback as the voice of the global South, as a leader of the global South. And so the number one thing to look out for is, does that happen? Number two is, will Ukraine dominate G20 as it did the G7? So this is the second thing that I think India has to look out for, and other countries also. Will G7 simply make this another meeting to talk about Ukraine? What should we do about Russia? How should we punish Russia? And then when they have some time from that, while they're waiting for fresh cups of coffee, they say, oh, let's do something to contain China. And then they get back to, well, what can we do to make sure that Ukraine wins the war against Russia? It's all about that, as if there's no other agenda in the world. In fact, I would recommend that Indian customs officers make sure that they check Macron's and Biden's planes when they land. They might sneak Zelensky in a box or in a suitcase to G20, who is not invited. India did not invite Ukraine to this meeting. So it's very interesting that the absence of Zelensky, who lobbied very hard to be invited to G20, if he had come, or if he comes, then finish, forget about the global South, forget about the rest of the world. In fact, India should simply leave the building and go away and let the US and Zelensky and France and all the G7 countries just talk about Russia, Russia, Ukraine, Russia. That will be the finish of G20. The rest of the world doesn't matter at the moment. So the second thing is to look out for is to what extent Ukraine dominates. There's no way Ukraine is not going to be spoken of. If you look at the White House press secretary, in a question that when she was asked, she made it very clear that Ukraine will be an important issue, and then talked about the transition from fossil fuel economy to sustainable economies and green economies and sources of power. So apparently there are only two issues on Biden's agenda at the moment. One is to talk about Ukraine, and the other is to talk about how to end dependency on fossil fuels. So that's the second thing to look up on, is to what extent Ukraine dominates the agenda of G20 to the exclusion of the rest of the world. The third question that I think we should all look up, the third issue is what happens with the final communique? Will there be a consensus? There was a consensus last year, and a lot of credit is given to the president of Indonesia for his diplomatic skills to be able to come up with a draft which all countries have signed. And as I already informed you, the foreign ministers meet and the finance ministers meet in India did not come up with agreed upon communique, even though the language apparently was the same as the language at Bali when it comes to the paragraph on Ukraine. So this is going to be India's challenge. Can India exert enough diplomatic support to do two things: to compel G7 to reduce the intensity of the language? There's no way the West will agree to leaving Ukraine out of the final communique. So the question is how severely they target Russia and blame Russia, and what else they propose. They may propose new sanctions right here at G20. So India's task will be to reduce the hostility, the intensity of what the G7 would like to see in the communique about Russia and Ukraine, and also try and compel Vladimir Putin, who's not coming. I'm assuming Lavrov, his foreign minister, will be there to try to push Putin to accept a little bit more harsher language than last year. So this is the task that India try to bring the G7 down a little and raise Russia's tolerance for Western rhetoric a little bit more, so that a final communique can come out. So this is going to be a real test for India's diplomacy. I wish the Indian External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, all the best. And I think if anybody can pull it off, he can. The fourth thing that I think to keep an eye on, this is, in my opinion, even more important than whether the final communique comes out or not. That's like a diplomatic, victory. But what I feel is what happens on the sidelines often is more important than what happens in the main forums, unless there's some massive decisions that are being made in the main forums. So the bilaterals that I think we need to look up and see whether they take place or not is number one. The most important one would be Biden versus Xi. Do they meet? In the past few months, the United States has sent Secretary Blinken, Janet Yellen, and now Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce. So we've had at least three Americans go, and I think, yeah, only three American secretaries have already visited Beijing in the past few months, trying to cool down the rhetoric and improve relations, or at least communications between the two superpowers. And the assumption is that it eventually will culminate in a major meeting between Biden and Xi. It could happen in India at the G20, or it could happen in November in San Francisco. Well, we will see what happens. So the thing to look up is, do they meet? Is there going to be a bilateral between the two of them? The second bilateral, which I think would be very important, is Xi and Modi. Will they meet? They had a small tete-a-tete in Johannesburg at the BRICS, and it raised so much hope that the tensions will subside, the border issues could be resolved, and then trade and investments will simply flow, and there will be wonderful things happening in Asia. The security environment would become more calmer, and the trade environment will get hotter. That's what we want. War talk less, business talk more. So the second most important bilateral would be Narendra Modi versus Xi. In fact, I strongly recommend that the meeting be far more comprehensive, that Narendra Modi meets with Xi and Jaishankar meets with his counterpart, and the defense minister Rajnath Singh also meets with his counterpart. So they have a comprehensive dialogue and try to really get beyond Galwan 2020. The third one would be Biden and Narendra Modi. Will they meet? Will the US India partnership strengthening take another step forward? And what would that be? We need to look out for that. So Narendra Modi and Joe Biden, will they have a formal bilateral or not? The fourth one is the interesting one. Erdogan is coming. And so will India and Turkey have a dialogue? Will Narendra Modi have a bilateral with Erdogan? And the fifth one is, will Erdogan also meet with Biden? And these are the five interesting bilaterals that I would like to see whether they happen or not, either way. So that is the fourth important thing. And the fifth one is, I'm very disappointed with Joe Biden's foreign policy and his leadership. He has reduced the American president from the stature of a global leader to the leader of the West, from world leader to Western leader. To him, nothing matters these days in the world except Ukraine. And so every forum he goes, it's all about Ukraine. In fact, the rest of the West is also not on board with him. For example, at the NATO summit this year, there were two requests that were made by Ukraine. There were two requests made for membership, and NATO said yes to Sweden and no to Ukraine. They not only said no to expediting Ukrainian membership, but the way they answered the question, they said that even if the war stops, so Ukraine will have to, meet the standards that a country needs to meet in order to become a member of NATO, and that usually takes more than a decade or two, and fundamental structural shifts in the country itself. So basically, NATO said no to Ukraine as far as membership is concerned. And so Biden, guess what he does? He then gets G7 together and gives guarantees to Ukraine that G7 will continue to give them whatever they need till whenever they need. So to me, it appears that Joe Biden has reduced the stature of the American president from a world leader to leader of the West, or basically the marketing manager of Ukraine. Will he step up at this G20 and address the problems of the global South, the debt as a result of the war, the food insecurity, the fertilizer insecurity, the energy security, the tensions in various parts of the world, whether you look at Sudan or Niger or other parts? Is America going to step up and play the role that it seeks all the time and seeks to defend so aggressively as a global hegemon. So that is the fifth thing that I would like to see. So I hope you found this briefing, this diplomatic briefing, interesting, thought-provoking. And if you watch this, then do follow through observing what's happening at the G20 summit. And then probably 2 weeks from now, maybe 11th or 12th of September, I will do a review of what happened at G20, and let us see if some of the things that I've talked about today happen or not. So until next time, this is Muqtedar Khan, your host. Be nice, be safe, be wonderful, be nice to each other. And don't forget to subscribe to Khanversations, ring the bell icon, and also share the video with your friends. This is Muqtedar Khan. Take care.